When we talk about climate, I guess most people would only think about like solar farms or EVs. But actually, the way we look at climate, we try to divide it into five pillars. So, first, renewable energy. Second is electric mobility. Third is energy efficiency and resource management. Fourth is climate smart agriculture. And lastly, the fifth pillar is waste and circularity. So we think across these five sectors, there's a lot of interesting opportunities that can be solved. And also, when we approach these five sectors, it's not just about climate mitigation, which is decarbonization, but there's also opportunities in climate adaptation, which means it's adapting to the climate, to the results of climate change.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, Sierra founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of two daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Hey, Larry, excited to have you on the show. You are an Indonesian who is a consultant, engineer, and now VC in climate tech. So lots to unpack there. Larry, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy, for having me here. Hi everyone. My name is Larry. I'm currently an AVP of Investments at ACV. Just a short background maybe about ACV. ACV, we're a fund based in Jakarta, Indonesia, investing in Southeast Asia across different stages.
So, Larry, one thing we share in common is we both went to UC Berkeley.
Right, go
and
Bears.
You were an engineer. Go Bears. Yeah. And, you were a chemical engineer. So why did you want to be a chemical engineer?
Honestly, growing up, I've been really interested in science. Chemistry to me feels like magic. And I think as a boy, I was super interested in trying to explore that a bit further. And just being realistic at that time, I just Googled like top paying jobs and chemical engineering was one of them. And I thought it was a perfect fit with what I'm interested in and also what the market pays.
And what was it like being a student at UC Berkeley? I think there's a huge Indonesian community. I was part of the Singapore Malaysia Student Association, which is obviously a different club, but smaller than the Indonesian community. What was it like for you at Berkeley?
It was a very rewarding experience. I really, really enjoyed my time at Berkeley. We do have a quite strong and big Indonesian community. I would say at that time, maybe around 150 students. We are very close with each other. We do have a lot of events. Everyone's very supportive. And even until now, when we go back to Indonesia, we are still quite connected with one another. But as you know, like Berkeley is one of also the top schools in US. So it was not an easy period, I would say. There's a lot of classes, a lot of assignments, but having a lot of friends, a lot of community really helped me go through Berkeley and also make long-lasting friendships.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is that, you were in Indonesia studying chemical engineering and you spent, effectively 3+ years in the US, in California, being a research engineer, working with batteries. Could you share more about that? Why you decided to stay in America and work on that?
Yeah. So I stayed, I think, for a total 7 years in the US, mostly in Bay Area. So after 4 years in college, after graduating from Berkeley, I took a opportunity to become a research engineer in a solar cell startup, also in the Bay Area. I think at that time, connecting a little bit to my motivation of becoming a chemical engineer, I'm very fascinated with chemistry. I'm fascinated about new technology, and climate and sustainability and renewable energy is actually one of the sectors and topics that I'm very interested and passionate in. In fact, throughout college, I've always been participating in different research groups across the campus, developing new technologies such as artificial photosynthesis or new ways to treat wastewater. And when I got the opportunity to actually work as a research engineer in a solar startup, I decided to go for it. I guess it was something that as a child who's very interested in science and chemistry, to be able to actualize it for my first job was definitely very interesting and something that I was very excited to pursue.
What was it like being a research engineer working on, all these like solar cells and batteries?
So I would say research, if you break it down day to day, it can be a bit monotonous because when you run experiments, right, you have to set it up, you do the whole experiment for the whole day, and you'll get one data point by the end of the day. And you do have a lot of hypotheses, a lot of experiment sets that you have prepared and planned. So just to come up with a conclusion for one parameter, for example, it would take days. But I think it's about the bigger picture when you decided to play around with different parameters and when you see something starting to work. I think that's when it becomes really rewarding. Maybe just to share a bit more about the startup that I work with in the Bay Area. So actually, after I joined around 2.5 years, they got acquired by a larger company. So they were able to sell their technology to this parent company. And I think as part of the very small team, so at that time there's only five of us. So I guess I played a quite big role in terms of the developing the product itself, even to the extent of going to China to test the products that we develop at the customer's manufacturing line. And then it wasn't easy as well. I cannot speak Mandarin. So every time I flew to China, a lot of sign language needs to be used to be able to interact with our customers. And it also didn't like moving from the lab to the actual pilot line and actual production is not that straightforward. Things might work well in the lab in the US, but when you actually try to bring your technology to an actual manufacturing line in a different country, in a different operating conditions, you need to do actually a lot of iteration. So the whole journey wasn't easy, but I think after 1 or 2 years of iteration, it turned out to be quite positively received, and we ended up with a quite, I would say, successful acquisition by the parent company.
And what's interesting is that, you're here in California, effectively part of the, the broader Silicon Valley ecosystem, right? Research, startups, acquisitions, technology transfers. And then you made a decision to travel back to Indonesia and become a product manager at Bukalapak. Could you share about that decision, why you decided to go back to Indonesia? Because there are so many Indonesians who say, yeah, moving to California and Berkeley, fantastic, right? And then moving back to Indonesia, question mark, right?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
So at that time, I did spend a lot of time debating with myself if I wanted to continue my journey in the US or have to go back to Indonesia, my home country. But I think it boils down to two things. I think, first of all, if you stay in the US, of course, you have to have the right visa and you need to get it. For a work visa, it's also a lottery system. So I had to go through a few lotteries to be able to get the work visa. And I think second for me is just the long-term aspiration. I do feel that there is a calling for me to go back to my home country to give back. And at the same time, I feel like there is a large opportunity still untapped in Indonesia, although it might not be the same ones that I'm pursuing in the US, like doing deep tech research, right? I would say in the US, the technology and the research advancement is much more ahead compared to Indonesia. But there is also still a lot of opportunities here in Southeast Asia that can be harnessed.
And what's interesting is that you became, obviously a product manager, which is a different kind of like field and domain, right? As a product management versus doing research. So what was that transition like? You're moving countries and you're moving industries and you're moving roles, right? So I'm just kind of curious, what was that learning curve for you?
Yeah. So I think for me, the decision to move to product management, there's a few aspects. I guess the first one is I was just trying. So when I moved back to Indonesia, I was actually looking for opportunities in similar fields. So looking into renewable energy, battery storage, startups or companies here. But unfortunately, at that time, this was around 2019. It's still very, very nascent, so not a lot of opportunities there. Second is that when I look at my friends who actually go back to Indonesia, a lot of them move to tech. And when I was in the Bay Area as well, a lot of my friends that I hang out with are all software engineers. So actually, I got some exposure to the tech world. And I think when I decided to come back, I had to make a decision either to maybe start something by my own, because in renewable energy or in like green energy, because the opportunity isn't there yet, or find something that's available, find a job that's available that might, even though it might deviate with my own initial passion or interest, it can still give me something to learn. I thought about it, and I decided that product management is an interesting, I guess, a stepping stone in a way, because you do have the exposure to tech, but at the same time, you get a lot of opportunities to interact with customers, trying to understand about business, trying to understand about solving real problems and creating a solution that lasts, right? So I decided to go for it and uh, transition from being an engineer to a product manager.
What was it like being a product manager?
Because I do have friends in the tech world in the US, in the Silicon Valley, so I do have some expectations of product management. And I would say actually the product management in the West is slightly different than what I experienced here when I was a product manager at one of the e-commerce startups in Indonesia. Initially, I thought, so product management, I read books about it. I think it's more about like product vision, product strategy, owning a lot of the business aspect also. But I think in reality, at least when I was a product manager here in Indonesia, most of my time day to day is spent more on dealing with operational challenges and problems, trying to make sure that the product that is already out there will function as it's supposed to, as it is designed to. And yeah, I felt a lot of my time, at least for the first 6 months to 1 year, was a lot of firefighting. I think I was only able to start developing after like almost of the large fires have been settled. So it was and also for me, because I didn't have any like real tech background, right? So a lot of it in the first few months was actually learning on the job, trying to understand how product management works, and at the same time tackling all the operational issues that was ongoing.
And then you went to Bain, where you were there for 3 years. So we both share that same Bain consulting experience. But what was the experience like for you for those 3 years?
Oh, Bain was amazing. I don't know how you felt when I was at Bain. I think Bain was a very rewarding, a very fun experience. And one of the reasons why I decided to transition from product management to Bain was also to get more of that higher level strategy exposure that I wasn't exactly receiving when I was a product manager. Definitely the first few months wasn't easy, because I also didn't have any background in finance or business. I was like a pure engineer by training. So I had to learn a lot from my peers, learning directly from my mentors on the case. And everyone there was very supportive of each other. There is this phrase that we used to say at Bain, which is a Bainey never lets another Bainey fail. So I think I really experienced that people was very supportive of the transition of the learning, and definitely not easy. From my part, I needed to put a lot of hours as well, a lot of time for preparation and also for ramping up on the job. But I think after a couple of months, I was able to transition quite well with the job. So maybe a bit of my experience at Bain as well. So the first year I was at their private equity group. So I did a lot of commercial due diligence projects, and these projects are very fast paced, short project duration. So I think it was a good exposure for me to really ramp up quickly. And after that, the next around 2 years, I spent in the general pool, where I was exposed to different kind of projects across strategy, across operating model, value creation. And actually, I was lucky enough to be able to be part of projects that I'm very excited about, that overlaps with my interest in climate and renewable energy and sustainability. So I help coming up with like EV strategies for automotive clients, developing also the JV for like a plastic recycler. Mm, One of the other projects that I help with was actually Bain. Every year we release this green economy report for Southeast Asia. So I was lucky enough to be part of that. project in 2023 as well.
And I think Bain is fantastic. And actually, I'll be collaborating with them to also discuss the Southeast Asia Economy Internet report as well
Nice.
in the coming year as well, help them release that. And then you went on to become a VC at ACV. So what happened there?
Yeah. So I think after a couple of years at Bain, I mean, just connecting back to my initial story, I've always been passionate and very interested in climate and sustainability. And even, I mean, at Bain, it's great, but you're exposed to a lot of different sectors, right? Sometimes sectors that you're not so interested and passionate about. And I think after around like in 2024, a couple of my friends who are also ex-Baineys moved to ACV and they reached out. They know that I was very passionate and interested in the climate sector, and they told me that there is this opportunity that as a fund, ACV wants to focus more on climate investments as well. So they asked me if I'm interested to explore this opportunity or not. And I think for me, it was a very good overlap of what I've been doing and also my interests because also at Bain, I was part of their private equity group, so I had a good exposure in the doing due diligence for PE clients. And I think that with that experience, plus my background in chemical engineering and also working in renewable energy startups in the US, would be a good fit to transition into climate investing. So that's why I decided to pursue that opportunity.
So I think this is a good segue into the next chapter, which is really talking about climate tech and Indonesia startup ecosystem. So I guess the first question I have to ask you is, now that you've been in the Indonesia ecosystem for many years, but you're also part of the California ecosystem, I'm just kind of curious, how do you compare those two technology ecosystems?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. So I would say maybe first of all, when we talk about climate tech, I think the first thing that pops up to someone's mind is like a very innovative, deep tech solution that someone is trying to develop to solve the earth, right? To save the earth. But I think in terms of climate, one of the differences that I notice is also I think I would classify there's two types of solutions. So one is more of like the deep tech physical solution. Second is more, I would say, business model innovations. So this means you would take an existing technology that is already quite mature, that is developed from maybe a different country, and you would try to adapt it to make it work in a new country that you would bring it in. I would say in California or the West, as I touched upon earlier as well, the development and the research and the resources dedicated for climate is more advanced compared to Southeast Asia. So the opportunities there is more like, oh, I was developing a new solar paste technology, or so I was developing a new lithium battery technology. While versus in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, most of the time, the opportunities here is more on simply bringing something that's already mature and trying to make it work here in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. For example, one of the companies that we invested in is a solar CNI developer. So they build solar on rooftops of office buildings or industrial clients. The technology itself is something that's already mature and proven in other countries.
And in terms of the kind of like talent pool and capital pools, how do you feel like there's a difference between the Silicon Valley and Indonesia ecosystem?
Yeah. Uh, Talent pool, I think for sure, because I would say climate and sustainability is something that is still more nascent here in Southeast Asia. The talent is not as readily available if you compare it to the US or the West in general. But I would say there's growing interest. So there's more and more people, especially the younger generation, who is very interested in this topic and wanted to build a career in this sector. And also there's people I would say like me, who would had already had an education or experience outside and decided to come back to build something here in the Southeast Asia. In terms of the capital pool itself, I would say, of course, a lot of the public capital is more readily available in the West. You can see there's a lot of grants, a lot of incentives, and also in terms of the private capital pool, there's also a lot of VCs, a lot of investors that has already been focusing in the sector for a couple of years. So that's why there are startups that I was able to work in. But I would say in Southeast Asia, it's still quite nascent and there's still gaps in terms of the capital pool landscape as well. So maybe the availability of the capital is leaning towards one edge versus the other. So maybe there's still more only in the earlier stage and only on the later stage, but not so much in between. So I think as a fund, ACB, we are also trying to bridge that gap. So we actually see a lot of venture builders or investors that are excited about this sector, but more on the very early stages, pre-seed to seed rounds. And there's also the big guys who are more comfortable in investing in larger projects that comes at the later stage. So hopefully, as a fund, we can help bridge this gap in this white space to help more companies be able to grow from the very early stage to a size large enough and mature enough for the larger investors to come in down the line.
What's interesting is that you're also building in the climate tech space, right? So, I think the problems that you talked about in terms of like obviously Indonesia and Southeast Asia having less talent and capital compared to Silicon Valley is stuff that I think we both would agree on. But climate tech is even more nascent as a vertical, right? So could you tell me what the thesis is between climate tech as a vertical thesis for Indonesia?
Yeah. So I think when we talk about climate, I guess most people would only think about like solar farms or EVs. But actually, the way we look at climate, we try to divide it into five pillars. So first, renewable energy. Second is electric mobility. Third is energy efficiency and resource management. Fourth is climate smart agriculture. And lastly, the fifth pillar is waste and circularity. So we think across these five sectors, there's a lot of interesting opportunities that can be solved. And also, when we approach these five sectors, it's not just about climate mitigation, which is decarbonization, but there's also opportunities in climate adaptation, which means it's adapting to the climate. To the results of climate change. For us, we think there's equal opportunities in all these five sectors. Maybe renewable energy or waste or EV would be a little bit more mature compared to the other two. But the thesis is, I think, for all of these sectors, we do have a lot of opportunities and a lot of available readily to be solved problems. So I think it's just about finding the right solutions to these problems and helping the companies to scale. And maybe another thing that I want to point out is in the West, probably the regulations there would help or accelerate the adoption of certain technologies. But I think here, what's different is beyond giving the proposition of being green or reducing the carbon emissions, the solutions that this company brings need to be financially viable as well. So usually it would give an additional economical benefit on top of the green benefit or the decarbonization benefit that it offers.
I think the sense from the ground is like, hey, climate tech is not popular now, right? I think in 2025, there's very much sense that there's a pushback against, kind of like climate tech, ESG, right? For example. So how do you react to that?
Yeah. So of course, unfortunately, right now, globally, there is some shift or a shift in perspective in terms of how people see climate, how people see sustainability, DI, and these topics. But I think my view is if we believe that there is a real problem and the sector actually has solutions that would solve this problem, I think it would definitely be resilient enough to where through these different cyclical perspectives or challenges that it's currently facing. And for me, I think climate is falls under that category. I think there is real value beyond just like people would usually say greenwashing for branding, right? There is actually a problem that the world is currently facing and we need these solutions. And once that problems become dire enough, then I would say people would realize that climate tech sector is actually a sector that is solving one of the most important problems that the world is currently facing, and it will be here to stay.
One thing that people are changing their minds on is whether we're moving towards like for example, more renewable energy is part of the mix versus, I think, let's just get as much energy as possible, whether it's from renewables or carbon energy, because energy is a finite resource and we need as cheap as possible in the context of growing our economies, growing our manufacturing, and powering our AI data centers, right? Where do you fall between these two camps from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's always a tension between focusing on like economic development, and when you do that, you need to get as much as cheap energy as much as possible so you can accelerate that growth, versus like long-term sustainability, long-term sustainable growth. I would say definitely not an easy topic to decide. I can see the importance of both, but I would want to argue that it's important to think of things in the long term perspective instead of just the short term. So it's very important for us as investors and also for innovators in developing these solutions to be able to accelerate the technology or the solutions that we can offer as well, so that it doesn't have to be a compromise to be able to achieve economic growth by choosing sustainability long term, but we want to be able to offer solutions that we can still grow sustainably at a pace that is good enough using these solutions that are available out there.
What's interesting, of course, is that Indonesia obviously has a lot of the nickel, a lot of the minerals needed for electric cars and vehicles. But, if you take a step back, it feels like most of the energy is either happening, of course, in America, right? Where there's the research and obviously there's Tesla. A lot of energy seems to be happening, obviously, in China as well. And even if you look at, Southeast Asia, you see that a lot of this electric vehicle, kind of, let's say, manufacturing or building chain seems to be happening in Vietnam or Malaysia instead of Indonesia, right? Which seems to have all the raw materials, actually. So I'm just kind of curious how you think or see that playing out.
Yeah, for sure. I think you brought a very good point about us, Indonesia, having the natural resources but lack the downstreaming infrastructure to actually build the end product itself, like batteries or EVs. But I think this is something that the government is trying to improve on. So a lot of the initiatives or the incentives that the government has is to focus on downstreaming. So it's harnessing the availability of the material, and then also trying to build up the infrastructure and build up the required factories in order to be able to process this raw material and convert it into a higher value material, and even at the end product itself. So I think we've seen a lot of investment coming into this part as well. This would usually come from the large battery makers, large automakers, investing a lot of their capital and resources to build up a facility here in Indonesia. And I think it's a good it's a good direction where this is all going. So yeah, hoping to see that this investments will pay out in the near future.
Do you think it will work out? I mean, what are the risk factors for this playing out in terms of like, kind of like, you call it adding value, right? Another one, like you said, is moving downstream from just the raw materials. But, what are the risk factors that make or break for the success of this? Because there are many countries that succeed. Obviously, I think Malaysia and Vietnam are doing a good job. I think kind of like increasing the value of their end product of that they can manufacture and build as a country. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what are those risk factors that are important to consider in the context of Indonesia?
Yeah, I think first of all is about the regulatory incentives. I think it's very important that the government is aligned with the long-term vision so that the private money or the investments that the corporates make here could be used in the most effective way. And also with the incentives, it will help them lower the cost as well to jumpstart something, right? I think second is more on the execution itself. I think doing business in a new country is obviously going to be challenging. So even if this large MNCs would come in, they need to be able to adapt to how they do business on the ground here in Indonesia. And I think one way to mitigate that is to find local partners who are already experienced and have the knowledge to work with the local people, finding the right talent, and also finding the right opportunity set and stakeholders to work with.
What do you think about the engineering issue, right? In terms of talent as well. I think there's an interesting debate, right? Obviously, we all know that China is full of engineers, and Vietnam is also has a huge focus on education. So there are a lot of engineers, and I think that's been one of the what's the word, pull factors for companies trying to
Mm,
locate because they need that engineering pool. I think obviously Malaysia and Singapore would be more like one cluster as well, because if they locate a factory in Malaysia, Malaysia and Singapore, there's actually a lot of like shared talent pool as well, especially with the Johor Special Economic Zone. But I think for Indonesia, it's kind of like, I'll say third in that, within Southeast Asia, right? In terms of like the perception that there's a deep enough engineering research, pool, talent wise, etc., to be able to support these. What do you think about that?
yeah, engineering talent, like you mentioned, right? I would say Indonesia is not the top of the list in terms of the other Southeast Asian countries. At least that's the perspective or the perception that people have. But I would say there is also a good interest and also a good pool of talent that is currently in the pipeline. So I wouldn't say that the education here is bad. It's actually there's a lot of universities that provide decent education, especially in engineering. We do have like a couple of top schools here in the country also that has produced a lot of strong engineering talents. So I would say there's still enough engineer talent here locally to support this incoming investments and infrastructure that we are building. But of course, it would be great if there is more push also from the governments to be able to put the right resources, allocate the right investment in the education to support the growing economy.
So you've written several like research reports, obviously, on Indonesia and the green economy, with Bain as well as with ACV. Can you share me some like key insights or numbers that you think would be something that people don't really know or should know more about?
Key insights or numbers. I think maybe one thing that I want to highlight is just how big the opportunity is. For example, in Indonesia, just looking at the renewable potential, there is I think around 5 gigawatts of solar. 5,000 gigawatts of solar potential that is readily available to be harnessed. In reality, right now in Indonesia, we only have like less than 1 gigawatt installed already. So there's still a very big gap right now. Second, also in terms of the electric vehicle penetration as well, we have around 120 million bikes on the road. And right now, EV penetration is less than 1%. So there is still a very, very huge potential, a very, very huge untapped market that can be transformed with the right solutions and investments. And I think we estimated 3 trillion US dollars for these investments to decarbonize Southeast Asia.
So let's talk about that, right? Which is that penetration obviously is a huge issue for that. For the startups that are tackling the problem, I've noticed that, I think there are two major patterns. I think one is it's solved by either themselves in-housing and building out their own technology stack. The second one is they're doing some kind of partnership where they bring in technology from somewhere else. Or the third is that, the problem can be solved by some other international country, expanding to Indonesia as well, right? Bringing their products. So, what do you think is the right approach from your perspective for this adoption change?
Yeah, I think it would be a mix of both depending on the problems that they are trying to solve. For example, I think the initial example that I gave about solar, the technology itself, we wouldn't necessarily require to build our solar cell technology or solar module technology. We could take some existing mature technology from China, for example, and then build up the solar on the rooftops in Indonesia, and that would work out fine. But at the same time, for example, for EVs, what we notice is it's not as simple as bringing an electric bike from China and sell it to the customers here, because the design and the specification might not suit the actual driving condition and the road terrain in Indonesia. So there needs to be some kind of product development and product also improvements in terms of the specification so that the customers here can have the best experience. So that's why I would say it's a mix of both, depending on the challenge itself.
I mean, I think the electric motorbike one is a good example, right? Do you think it's big enough a niche for a startup to be able to build independently? Or do you think it's something that's more like, hey, some Chinese team needs to localize their product and build a new SKU for the Indonesia terrain?
So I would say being able to, like, if an Indonesian team is the one that builds this solution, they would be definitely more knowledgeable about the requirements by the customers. And I think the opportunity set and the market potential is big enough for a startup to tackle this. In fact, I think when we look globally, the sector where we see insurgents, startups being able to dominate or take a significant share is in the two-wheeler EV sector. Not so much on the four-wheeler, because we do have the large car automakers globally already releasing the EV product. But for example, in India, we can see a couple of new names, new startups in the two-wheeler EV space gaining significant traction and having good enough market.
So could you share a personal story about a time that you've been brave?
Yeah, I wouldn't think of myself as a very like brave person per se. I would actually think like I'm a very risk averse person, but I did jump out of a plane once because my friend forced me to. But I think throughout this conversation, I've actually like jumped a lot in terms of my career. Like I started as an engineer, I did a product management, I went into strategy consulting, and now in investments. I feel like for me growing up, I always had this image that I am like a science student, that would be something that I would do in the future. I would just develop a new technology in the lab and then release it to the world. Never would like a 12-year-old me thought that I would become a consultant or even someone in finance, or even when I was in college, I would never have thought that I would go into investments. But I think what we need to do, at least what I've learned to do, is to be able to just look at the readily opportunities that's available and make that leap of faith. So that's what I decided to do when I shifted my career. And it wasn't easy, for sure. A lot of time investment, a lot of resource investment, but I would say it has been a very worthwhile jump that I made. Like, I guess similar to skydiving.
Thanks so much for sharing. I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways. First of all, thanks so much for sharing about your experience, kind of studying in Berkeley, California, as well as your early job there, and weighing that versus going back to Indonesia. And I think that's such an important part, because I think there are so many Indonesians who dream about going to California and Berkeley. I think that's one side. But also there's so many Indonesians who are also wondering whether they would return back to Indonesia. So thanks so much for sharing about that personal set of trade-offs and decisions. Secondly, thanks for sharing about your perspective on the technology ecosystems between California and Indonesia, and speaking, I think, a little bit more about the fact that Indonesia doesn't have as much capital or talent compared to Silicon Valley, but there are opportunities in terms of the market opportunity and potential, as well as the business model innovation, right, which is a different style of business creation versus America. And lastly, thanks so much for sharing about climate tech. I thought it was just interesting to hear about that push and pull between whether it's popular or not popular now versus what we think is the market opportunities. And I think some of the risk factors that we need to think about, which is really about, obviously the regulatory incentives by the government, whether they are aligned and consistent with that policies, as well as continuing to build out the workforce that is skilled enough to advance this kind of climate tech industry as well in Indonesia. So on that note, thank you so much, Larry, for sharing your experience.
Thank you, Jeremy, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.